mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. This morning's message got its start as I was sitting amongst the middle school boys on Monday night at our Focus on Youth program. And I was sitting there during the worship part, and I was listening, and I just noticed that the pitch was higher than you might expect. And that's because the middle school boys were doing anything and everything other than singing the songs projected. And I noticed this especially because I had just gotten done the previous summer doing vacation Bible school, and there I enjoyed the frenetic sounds of K through 4th grade girls and boys singing and dancing to the worship songs, and it made me wonder, what happens between elementary and middle school? What so shut the vocal cords of boys in 6th grade? So I was thinking about this, and this was sort of sitting with me, and I was in the Sunday service and listening and realizing that apart from the men in the robes up front here, the bass clef was noticeably quiet also in this sanctuary. And it made me think of a PSA that I used to hear when I was a kid, of the parent that asked their kids, where'd you learn to do drugs? And they said, I learned it from you. I learned it from watching you. And I wonder if our middle school boys might say, I learned it from you, Dad. I learned it from watching you. So this morning I want to talk about how, this is not a rant about the decline of music, and it's not a downer about dads, so don't worry. But it does illustrate a point, and this is the point I want to talk about today, is we learn by watching. We learn what is right and proper and true by modeling from others. This morning we find ourselves in the book of Hebrews. Now chapter 11 had just, the author of Hebrews had cataloged like all these great things that the Old Testament greats did, the acts of faith and the good deeds, and so he just sort of listed all of these things off. And then in the verse we started reading in chapter 12, verse 1, he sort of caps it by saying, seeing as how we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us then pursue the race set before us. And I think our church does a great job of putting forth the cloud of Bible witnesses. Whether or not it's spending a whole summer in the Old Testament, or the excellent curriculum that Susan sends our kids through in Sunday school, or the 8th grade confirmation class, we really are surrounded by the Bible stories, the heroes of the Bible. And yet, we're surrounded by them, but the race can sometimes become sort of a slow stroll by the time our kids get past confirmation or into college. And really, I think the pace has shifted a little bit even by the time we get to middle school. And not only our youth. The reality is that every year, some of our friends, our neighbors, that person that sat in the pew in front of you, so quit the race. And when we notice, we wonder why. Why isn't church working? This morning's message, it has, it's not an answer to the problem. I don't know why faith doesn't stick for some people. If I did, I'd write a bestseller. But I don't. But I do want to look in chapter 12 of Hebrews and see maybe if it has maybe part of a solution to this problem. This morning's message has 3 parts. The first part is a warning. You are witnesses about God. The second is an encouragement. You are witnesses to God. And the third is the takeaway, which is that you are to witness about God. All right, are you still with me here? All right. So, but before I jump in, I do want to think a little bit about that word witness, to witness, because, I think that word, especially in its sort of verbal noun form, witnessing, it kind of has a lot of baggage. But really, to witness is really just to see something and then to say something about that. So to witness to God is really to see what God has done and then to communicate around that. So this morning I want to encourage you, as we talk about witnessing and to witness and to being a witness, whatever feelings you might have around witnessing, I just ask you to sort of, put those aside and just think about that. To witness about God is really just to communicate what you have seen God do. All right, so let's jump in. So in chapter 12, the author is talking about what does it mean to run the race of faith. We aren't going to focus this on the first point that the writer makes. The writer talks a little bit about a complaint that the Hebrews had about, running the race of faith is sometimes hard and a little bit painful. And so the writer suggests that part of that pain is that God doesn't keep us from that because he loves us and he wants to create a disciplined faith. And just like children, if we make it too easy, if we don't allow them to overcome challenges, then they don't get the character they need to pursue life. And so that's sort of that first point. But I don't want to focus on that because I want to focus on the next sort of piece that the author talks about. So I'm going to read, this is in Hebrews, it's chapter 12, and we're going to start in verse 14 and 15. So Hebrews chapter 12, verses 14 and 15. Try your best to live at peace with everyone. Try to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. Be sure that no one misses God's grace. See to it that a bitter plant does not grow up. If it does, it will cause trouble, and it will pollute many people. So, did you catch what the author is sort of suggesting here about how people see God and how they obtain the grace of God? They learn it from you, church. They learn it from watching you. The first point of this message is a warning. It is that we are witnesses about God. Whether we want to or not, our children look at us when they want to know who God is. And when our friends want to know who God is, they look at us. And when the person in the pew next to you looks and wants to know who God is, they look at you. You might say, I don't want to be a witness. I'm not a good witness. Unfortunately, not to be harsh, but it's a little bit of a too bad because they are looking at you, and we learn by modeling. We learn by watching. We are all witnesses about God. So there's a pastor in New York City. His name is Tim Keller, and he did this talk with Google engineers. It's a really great talk. You can Google it, and Tim Keller and Google Talk. And it's this great message. But in this message, one of the things he talks about is how do we learn to believe what we believe and to disbelieve what we disbelieve, right? So where do we get that? And he suggests that we always choose what we believe or disbelieve about God based on three things: intellectual reasons, personal experience, and then social experience. And he says you can't separate any of each piece of this. We always believe these things from a mixture of all of these things. So whether or not you're an agnostic or an atheist or a Christian or a religious skeptic, these three things, intellectual, personal, social, always are a part of that process of determining belief. And it's this third reason, this social experience, that we're focusing on today. And one of the biggest pieces that Keller says about that social experience is about what people whom we respect believe. And it works the other ways. If we don't respect them, then what they believe. So like with faith, if we only see people we don't respect having faith, we're more likely to disbelieve. But if we see people whom we respect and we hear and see about their faith, we are more likely to believe. Because humans learn by watching and listening. We learn what we think and believe about who God is. And we're always sending messages. Whether we know it or not, we are always communicating something by what we do, if not by our words. So those who respect us, our children, our coworkers, our friends, they're looking at us. We are witnesses. This is why the author of Hebrews says we must pursue peace with everyone. We must seek after holiness. Now, the word holiness, to be holy, it's a bit of a church word, and I don't know if you, but if to be honest, sometimes it feels a bit meaningless to me. Holiness really means to be set apart for goodness, right? To set oneself apart for that which is good. So the holiness is created when you choose to participate or not participate in something not based on whether or not it's okay to do, but whether or not it's good to do. So why does holiness help people see God? It's because when we're living holy, we stand out. We can't help but be a witness. I like to tell the story. I love to tell the story of a summer I spent in Yosemite National Park. I did this ministry where I led worship for campers on Sundays, and then during the week I worked just a regular concessions job at the park, and I lived there in the park, and it was just this amazing experience, But I did note that most people that lived and worked in that park, they did so for two basic reasons. One is they loved the outdoors, and the second is they wanted to party all summer. It was a fun summer. But one night, towards the end of the summer, my roommates and I, we were laying on this face of a foothill, this stone face, and we were looking up at the stars, and the people down below were getting increasingly wasted. And one of my roommates, Nate, who himself was pretty far gone, looked at me and said, "How come don't you get wasted? Like, why aren't you into getting trashed?" And, he asked that because I stood out. Not because I was trying to. I wasn't judging. I wasn't standoffish. I was on that cliff. But he noticed something different. And so I became a witness because I stood out. So I thought about that for a moment, and I said, I don't need to. God gives me happiness, and I just don't need to. I'd just rather look at what he created. And Nate looked at me and thought for a second, and he said, "Oh, it'd be nice to feel that way." In that moment, I was a witness. Nate saw something different, something about God. In other moments, that's not who I am. In other moments, I allow, bitterness to come up, or I try to fit in. But the reality is, in each and every moment, whether or not we're showing God positively or not, we are witnesses. So that's the warning. But I have an encouragement. And that encouragement is that we are all witnesses to God. Everyone here this morning has seen God. I know that because you're here in this sanctuary at the end of the summer. You wouldn't be here if you hadn't seen God. Now, some of you might be quietly saying to yourself, "Well, I'm really here because my wife would be mad if I didn't, or my parents would take away my Xbox." But I would argue that you have seen God in that person, and that God has used that person to bring you here so that at some point you might more directly hear from God. You might see him more for yourself. I think too often we're quick to dismiss our experience of God as it's too limited. It's too small. It's not good enough. I remember I was in seminary and I was praying to God. I was preparing for ministry, and I was praying to God, and I was like, "God, give me this awesome, amazing experience of you. Let me just." I wanted that neon sign experience, and because I wanted a story that I could tell others to say, here's who God is, here's what I've seen of him, and just really make people believe. Because my story is pretty simple. It's pretty quiet. I grew up in the church. I was always there. I was always a decent person, and my faith grew gradually. God did not give me that neon sign. Instead, he made me realize that my story was enough. The reality is that God can use any real story to show himself, no matter how small. We have all seen God, and God can use that story. So, in our chapter this morning, chapter 12, it goes on in verses 18 through 24. It starts to talk about what Pastor Phil talked about earlier this summer about Israel, and they were in the desert and the mountain, right, and the glory of God. So listen in with me in verse 18. So this is verse 18 of chapter 12. You have not come to a mountain that can be touched. You have not come to a mountain that's burning with fire. You haven't come to darkness and gloom and storm. You haven't come to a blast from God's trumpet. You haven't come to a voice speaking to you. When the people heard that voice long ago, they begged it not to say anything to them. So that was Israel's experience. It was powerful. It was scary. But the author of Hebrews is contrasting that experience to our experience of faith. Right? So our faith isn't like that. It isn't so loud oftentimes. But he goes on to say, but you have come to Mount Zion. You have come to the Jerusalem in heaven. It is the city of the living God. You have come to a joyful gathering. There are thousands and thousands of angels. You have come to the church of God, people. So it's not so powerful, but it sounds a little more joyful, the experience that we have. So this morning I want to encourage you that to not limit your witness to the big stories, to feeling like you have to have this thing but tell your story, whatever your experience has been, however you have been impacted by God, whether or not it's simple or deep, just tell that story. It's a story that you can tell. You can tell it with your words. You can tell it with your actions, your choices in life, what you do or you don't do, but tell it. Because this morning I want to conclude with my final point, which is that you are to be witnesses about God. If you're still unsatisfied with your story, if you don't know what to say, if you don't feel like you have the experiences you want or you want more, there are ways to learn to see God more. You can actually take your cue from birders. I don't know if you've never noticed this, but bird watchers are great witnesses. They see birds everywhere. They see them because they have trained their eyes and ears and minds to hear, to see, to look. They're looking for these birds, and they see them. And I think we can do the same with our faith, with our experience of God, because God promises, he says in the book of Romans, he's not far from each of us, and he wants us to reach out to him. He's there. We have to see him. Look, the tools of training are well known. I'm not going to say anything new, but maybe just thinking about the purpose of these tools might help us develop a new habit. So the Bible is maybe like the guidebook for North American birds. I don't know if you've ever seen that. We have a copy of that. It tells you what you might expect God to look like. That's what the Bible helps us. It gives us a vision. We see who God is. Prayer is like listening to the sound, to like the call of the birds, right? Birders can differentiate the different sounds, the different calls for the bird they're looking for, and they do that because they've been listening. And that's what prayer is. Prayer is listening for the sound of God so that we learn to hear it and experience God through that. Committing to church attendance is like going to the conservancy where that bird that you're looking for lives and hangs out. You might not see the bird there that week, but it's much more likely than looking out your window at home. And it's the same thing as that God has promised that where there's worship, he's going to hang out. So the odds are, if you want to experience God, it's going to be here. I know, it's nothing new. But I do encourage you to consider them and to think about how they might help you have that a witness if you want to have that experience of God to share. There's a lot of little ways you can make this message concrete. You could tell your kids about how you came to faith. You could sing a little bit louder in worship, men. You could walk away from work conversations that aren't very noble. You could walk towards somebody that needs to see God in you. You could commit to seeking out more experience of God, maybe at a Bible study or at small groups or through daily devotions. You could tell a friend about what God has done for you. I could go on, but I hope that this week you consider who you might witness, who you might tell your story, whether or not it's through words or actions, but that you might tell your story, because the reality is, I've warned you, you are a witness. So why not do it with intention? Why not be active in our story so that what we communicate helps us so that no one fails to obtain the grace of God because of us? Amen.